Hi, thanks for clicking in. As you can see from the pictures and the slideshow there, that's my result on my restoration of my Victorinox Officers knife, model 1937. And I did a previous video. This is actually like the third in a three-part video on this knife, and the second video showed an attempt I made to fabricate a part to fix the scale, and I want to talk about that a little bit in this video. But before I get into that, let me just say, this is a 1937 model. That doesn't mean that that's the dating of this knife. Let me show you how I date this knife. First of all, tang stamps, Elsener Suisse, Swiss made. Victorinox says that was just used simply circa 1930-1940. But on the other side, inoxide, short for inoxidable, French term for stainless steel. They tell us they used that from 1943 to 1951. Also, this is kind of interesting, you'll see on this knife, on the screwdriver cap lifter, a tang stamp or stamp that says Swiss made, simply Swiss made. And that was used also from 1943 to 1951. However, this knife has the can opener, which was replaced by the lobster claw style can opener 1946. So that gives me some date ranges there to work with. I date this knife 1943, 1944, or 1945, which tells me it's a World War II era knife. Not to say that it was used in World War II. This is not a soldier's knife. But that this is a knife, World War II was in full swing in those years, and that makes this interesting to me. And I would also say that might make this knife a little rarer than the 1946 model. Even though, the 1946 model only had a 4-year run before they changed the can opener again in 1951, and this knife had a 9-year run. I would just assume that it was made in more limited numbers during World War II, particularly since that was before, the GIs came home from World War II familiar with these knives and started asking for them in North America. So that was really before these knives were sold extensively in North America, and I just would be willing to bet they're rare because of it. I know that I have seen a lot fewer of these than the 1946 models. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about what I did with this end piece. And watch that second video so you can see how I attempted to actually melt chunks of Celador, another Victorinox scale. Plastic is called Celador. Has a melting point of around 425 degrees. And I made, mold, and the idea was to melt the plastic and press it into the mold, but I had two problems. Number one, Celador never reaches really a flowable, like pourable state. It just, as it melts, it just turns into a piece of like sticky chewing gum. And if you try to get it up higher, it just starts to smoke and burn. So, I was melting blobs of this and snatching it out of the oven, and just as soon as it would come out of the oven, like within like 3 seconds, it would be rock hard again. It just rehardened almost immediately. So I was just snatching it out of the chunks out of the oven with a pair of forceps, throwing it on my mold and pressing it in there as fast as I could. And I got a couple of pretty decent shapes, emulating the piece that was missing. The only problem was, because of the way I had to press it in there, it was too thick. It had this base, and that would have had to have been cut away, and then also would have made it too thick, would have been ground away. But the second problem, and really the bigger problem, was, and I didn't realize this till I did this part came out too small. Now, you wouldn't be able to tell maybe now, but it was going to be way too small. And I was like, what happened? Well, I suppose what happened was the positive piece of clay that I made shrank. I pressed it into another piece of wet clay to make the mold. That probably shrank a little bit too. So obviously some size was lost there in the translation. So that didn't work. I went to plan B, which was to take, luckily I still had the end piece from the scale that I sacrificed, and I just manually shaped it with a Dremel and some sandpaper, and just eyeballed it until I got the that little raggedy shape pretty close. You know, the newer Victorinox knives are wider. They don't have this place for this cutout of this awl. A lot of issues there, but I just kept working with it until I got it to fit. I think I did a pretty good job. If we can see here, you know, it's real flush with the edge. It's smooth. It's been epoxied on there, and then of course there was a gap left. And I thought about doing some plastic welding to fill the gap, but you know, plastic welding will mar up the other surfaces, pucker them up, so I didn't want to do that. I thought about maybe some red fingernail polish, but at the end of the day I figured that epoxy, filling the crack with epoxy, would be the most durable long-term solution. So that's why I have a little black line there. But it all sanded smooth. You know, there's no ridge or anything here, and there's no crack to get dirt down in there. It's all filled in, and I'm happy enough with it. You know, it's obviously been repaired. The repair is evident. It always will be. But where before there was just a big missing piece of handle, now the knife is complete, and it's got integrity, and it's all Victorinox Celador material. The color is off, as you can see. The newer Celador is just a lighter red than the old Celador. I don't know why that is, but it is. But anyway, and you know, just this ought to be obvious, but just to mention, you know, you can't just pop these scales off and put a new scale on there, even if you had an old vintage scale. You know, their rivets come all the way through. There are cutouts. There's a bail. You know, it's just impossible. So my advice to someone, if you have an old vintage knife like this that's missing a piece of the scale and you want to fill it in, would be to get another piece of Celador and just manually carve it, sand it, grind it, shape it until you have what you want, and then epoxy it on there. I did have another plan with the molds, not to go too long on this, but I also made a mold while I had this, you know, positive piece of clay that looked like that. I made a mold with silicone. It's easy to do. Maybe you've done it before. You just mix silicone like caulk with a bunch of cornstarch until you get a non-sticky putty. And then you just press the piece that you want to make a mold of into that silicone. Let it dry, and then you pop it out. You let that silicone dry, and then you pop your piece out. It's like if you had an old antique button off of a jacket or something and you couldn't get a new one. You want to make a new one, you could do that. And then the idea is to buy casting resin, like a 2-part polyester resin, and pour it in there. My only problem with that is it was, you know, again, this piece had shrunk, so I knew that my silicone mold was going to be too small too. So I didn't bother with the expense of buying the casting resin. Plus, I would have had to put pigment in it, and you know how I would ever get enough red pigment to match that, you know, would be just totally trial and error. So I gave up on that and just went with the manual replacement. But anyway, there's the knife. Again, I'm real happy with it. It's got some cool features like the brass rivets and the brass liners, which I showed in the last video, but they came out just great. Look like gold. You know, that brass gives this thing really cool highlights, the brass liners and spacers. You know, I just dig the stampings. The old style can openers are way cool. You know, the Swiss made on the old screwdriver cap lifter. You know, it's a really nice knife. I'm real happy with it. I'm going to keep it. I'm hanging on to this one. I won't sell it until I find, you know, a better one or older, rarer one. Anyway, I know that was a long video. I appreciate you watching, and have fun collecting.